Welcome to this explainer. You know, when we study the pathophysiology of heart failure, it's really easy to just look at it as a dry, clinical diagnosis. But today, I want you to look at it as a tragic story. It's the story of a well-meaning pump pushed to the absolute brink of destruction by its own desperate defenses. For those of you studying medicine or stepping into clinical pathology, understanding this narrative is absolutely key to mastering heart failure.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to hit 1. The index event trigger. 2. Patterns of ventricular remodeling. 3. The panicked neurohormonal response. 4. Systemic collateral damage. And wrap up with 5. Atypical heart failure states. Let's get right to it.
Starting things off with Section 1, the index event trigger. So, heart failure, it isn't just some sudden endpoint you magically arrive at. It is very much a progressive decline. And it's always sparked by what the literature calls an index event. Maybe it's a myocardial infarction, a nasty viral infection, or just chronic severe hypertension. Whatever the specific insult is, this index event damages the myocardium or impairs its ability to pump or fill. Suddenly, the heart realizes it just can't meet the body's demands, so it's forced into this heroic, but, well, ultimately doomed compensation mode.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, patterns of ventricular remodeling. To survive that initial hit, the heart actually changes its very architecture. By definition, ventricular remodeling is the absolute central mechanism of heart failure. It's fundamental. The organ doesn't just sit there and fail. It actively alters its size, its shape, and its function to cope with this intense new workload. It is literally trying to save your life. But the tragic part is, the way it rebuilds itself sets the stage for its future failure.
We can break this remodeling down into 2 distinct classic patterns, a crucial distinction for clinical practice. First up, concentric hypertrophy. This happens in response to pressure overload. Think chronic hypertension or aortic stenosis. It's exactly like a bodybuilder constantly pushing against a heavy door. The muscle gets incredibly thick and stiff to generate more force. On the flip side, we have eccentric hypertrophy. This one is driven by volume overload, like a leaky mitral valve. Imagine an overfilled, floppy water balloon. All that extra volume stretches the cavity out, leading to massive ventricular dilation.
But the tragedy goes way deeper than gross anatomy, right? It's happening at the cellular level. When cardiac myocytes are under this much profound stress, they basically panic. They abandon their mature adult programming and revert to outdated emergency blueprints. The sources highlight a hallmark of this process, the re-expression of fetal genes, like beta-myosin heavy chain. And honestly, these fetal proteins just aren't designed for the demands of an adult body. They severely impair contraction. If the myocytes simply cannot adapt to the ongoing stress, they undergo apoptosis, programmed cell death, or necrosis, literally dying off and leaving behind useless, stiff scar tissue.
So the heart is struggling, the cells are literally dying, and the organ is physically reshaping itself into a stiff or floppy shadow of its former self. Which begs the question, how does the rest of the body react to this failing pump?
Well, let's look at Section 3, the panicked neurohormonal response.
When the heart's output drops, high-pressure baroreceptors in the body experience what we call unloading. They sense that drop in pressure and basically pull the systemic fire alarm. This activates a massive neurohormonal cascade involving 3 main middle managers. First, the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS. Second, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, RAAS. And third, arginine vasopressin, AVP, released from the pituitary gland. And right here is the tragic flaw of heart failure. These systems, they evolved to save us from acute blood loss, like a tiger attack, not a chronically failing pump. So instead of helping, they make things infinitely worse. The SNS cranks up the heart rate and constricts blood vessels, forcing an already weak heart to pump harder against higher resistance. RAAS pumps out angiotensin II, a potent vasoconstrictor, and aldosterone, which commands the kidneys to aggressively hoard salt and water. Then AVP chimes in by retaining even more free water. Not only does this massively increase the workload on the heart, but these hormones actually cause direct toxic damage and profound myocardial fibrosis. Now, the body isn't entirely oblivious to this colossal mistake. It tries to counterbalance the panic. As the heart stretches out, it releases natriuretic peptides, specifically ANP and BNP. As med students, you're going to see BNP labs drawn in the hospital all the time. This is exactly why. These peptides desperately try to promote vasodilation and force the kidneys to excrete all that hoarded sodium and water. But unfortunately, they're ultimately overwhelmed. They get drowned out by intense oxidative stress and elevated pro-inflammatory cytokines, like TNF-alpha and IL-6, which just drive further disease progression and even cardiac cachexia, that severe wasting we see in late-stage patients.
Moving right along to Section 4, Systemic Collateral Damage.
Let's see how this chemical storm floods the entire body. One of the most critical clinical manifestations here is cardiorenal syndrome. Think of cardiorenal syndrome exactly like a massive two-way traffic jam. On one end, you have forward failure. The weak heart has decreased cardiac output, which means reduced arterial perfusion. The kidneys are literally starving for fresh blood. On the other end, you have backward failure. Blood backs up behind the failing heart, causing severe venous congestion and increased abdominal pressure. This congestion backs up the plumbing right into the kidneys, squeezing them and completely ruining renal function. It is a devastating double hit.
And this systemic remodeling disorder severely impacts the heart's wiring, too. As the ventricles dilate and scar tissue forms, the electrical pathways get stretched and broken. Actually, up to a third of patients with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, or HF-ref, develop electrical dyssynchrony. A classic example you'll see is a left bundle branch block, or LBB. When those electrical signals are blocked or delayed, the left ventricle doesn't squeeze in one smooth, coordinated motion anymore. It squeezes unevenly, which impairs ventricular contraction even further and makes the mechanical failures so much worse.
And if that wasn't enough, the tragic cycle hits a terrifying mechanical loop known as secondary mitral regurgitation. As the left ventricle continues to dilate from all that volume overload, it physically pulls the mitral valve apparatus apart. The valve leaflets just can no longer meet in the middle. So when the heart squeezes, blood shoots backwards into the left atrium. There's your regurgitation. This backward flow means less blood actually goes to the body, and the extra volume just stretches the left heart out even more, which pulls the valve further apart, causing more regurgitation and stretching it even more. It's the absolute definition of a vicious cycle.
Finally, let's explore Section 5, Atypical Heart Failure States.
Because not all heart failure fits that classic picture of a dilated, weak pump, right? Let's examine a couple of states that break the traditional mold. The crucial point here is distinguishing these phenotypes. Typical HF-ref is a weak, failing pump, but heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, or HFpEF, involves a stiff pump. It squeezes fine, but it can't relax. Then, way on the far end of the spectrum, we have high-output heart failure. This is a bizarre state where the heart is actually a supercharged pump, pushing out massive volumes of blood, but it still fails because the body's metabolic demand is so incredibly high that even a supercharged heart just isn't enough.
Let's look a little closer at HFpEF. The sources show us that the mechanisms here are intimately linked to systemic comorbidities. Conditions like obesity and diabetes create this constant underlying state of chronic microvascular endothelial inflammation. This systemic inflammation fundamentally alters the heart muscle, making it incredibly stiff. Because it's so stiff, it suffers from impaired myocardial relaxation. It literally cannot stretch to fill properly during diastole, so pressures back up into the lungs, even though the actual squeezing function, the ejection fraction, appears totally normal on an echocardiogram.
Conversely, high-output failure is fascinating because the mechanics of the heart are generally fine. The heart is pumping fiercely, generating a super high cardiac output. The problem actually lies out in the periphery. Conditions like severe anemia or thyrotoxicosis from an overactive thyroid cause a drastic decrease in systemic vascular resistance. The blood vessels are wide open, and blood flows through them way too fast for the tissues to extract oxygen. So despite a booming cardiac output, the peripheral tissues are still functionally starving, which triggers all those same panicked neurohormonal alarms we discussed earlier. So we've seen today how heart failure is truly a tragic tale. The heart suffers an index event, and its desperate, heroic attempts to save itself through physical remodeling and neurohormonal panic become its very undoing. Which leaves us with a critical question to ponder, especially for those of you stepping into clinical practice right now. If the body's own defenses are what's causing the destruction, how and when should we pharmacologically intervene to block these systems and break this vicious cycle before it's too late? Think on that. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.